US-China economic conflict are likely to continue to be sources of tensions in the global economic system in the years ahead. What distinguishes China from other developing countries or transitional economies is the huge size of the Chinese economy. The Chinese leadership has adopted a set of policies to shift China's role from a factory of the world to both a technological and economic powerhouse with global influence and fewer dependencies.
What is China's view of its position in the global economy?
China has aspirations to participate in the global economy, not just on terms defined by Western countries, including the United States, but also seeks to reshape its role into that of a rule maker, technology leader, and standard setting. The Chinese leadership has actively sought to increase China's influence in international economic institutions. It has participated actively in legacy international economic institutions, such as the World Trade Organization or the WTO, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. But at the same time, the Chinese leadership has actively set up alternative institutions or the so-called parallel institutions, such as the AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, and the New Development Bank, to compete with the Western-dominated institutions. And in doing so, China is increasingly seeking to promote alternatives to Western-dominated economic order and models. And it is important to note that the current narrative seems to treat China as a unitary actor, a monolithic actor. But it's also important to notice that in recent years, as a result of the domestic liberalization and economic reform that have taken place, we are increasingly seeing the emergence of a wide range of actors that are increasingly playing important roles in Chinese foreign economic policy. These include bureaucratic actors, non-governmental organizations, as well as domestic business groups. And these actors have gained increasing voice and an increasing ability to influence the process of Chinese foreign economic policy making in a way that we haven't seen in the pre-reform period. As a result of the influence of these domestic forces, what we have seen is that China's behavior in global economic governance increasingly ranges anywhere from deep and shallow cooperation to shallow and deep opposition. So there's a wide spectrum of Chinese behavior in global economic governance institutions.
How does China's behavior vary in global economic institutions?
In terms of global trade, in global trade governance institutions such as the WTO, the Chinese leadership has actively participated in WTO dispute settlement. It has supported the trade liberalization agenda of the WTO to bring down tariff and non-tariff barriers throughout the member countries. Initially, while China was a relatively reluctant participant, over time, it has increased its participation to become a strong defender of the WTO's norm of reciprocity and national treatment. China has benefited, as a matter of fact, from the trade liberalization undertaken under the WTO and from its integration into the liberal international economic system. However, in other areas, we have also seen strong conflict between China and other Western countries, in large part as a result of the incompatibility of the Chinese model of economic governance and economic growth and those prevailing in Western countries. Despite the substantial liberalization has taken place, China remains a hybrid economy. A substantial part of its domestic economy continues to operate according to non-market principles. And yet the WTO is a liberal international economic institution that seeks to promote trade liberalization through the reduction and elimination of tariff and non-tariff barriers. So this puts the Chinese model of economic growth and economic development in sharp conflict with those championed by the United States and Western countries. So on issues such as industrial policy, the provision of subsidies, for instance, we have seen how this has emerged as a central issue of contention between the US and China, to the extent to which it has led the WTO into a situation of paralysis. At the same time, China champions the objective of special and differential treatment, or the so-called SDT, for developing countries, which provides developing countries with greater flexibility and longer transitional periods to bring their domestic economic practices in line with their WTO commitments. So in those areas, Chinese behavior are increasingly diverging from those of the Western countries. We're seeing strong US-China competition in the WTO that has really presented substantial challenge to the operation of the liberal international system. And while there were examples in the history of the WTO where developing countries, hybrid economies, transitional economies integrated themselves into the WTO, what distinguishes China from those other developing countries or transitional economies is the huge size of the Chinese economy. Never in the history of the WTO has a liberal international economic organization been subjected to the tremendous challenges coming from a country the size of China. So overall, we're seeing the growing influence of China's domestic model of economic development, its behavior on international governance institutions, so that we're increasingly seeing this sort of mix of Chinese behavior in the global economic arena.
What actions does China take to protect and promote its position in the global economy?
There has also been a relatively long history of the Chinese government restricting access to the Chinese domestic market in order to provide a hothouse environment for the Chinese companies to emerge and develop. For a long time, for example, foreign companies were required to form joint ventures with Chinese counterparts when they enter the Chinese market. This potentially served as a way of facilitating technology transfer from foreign companies to the Chinese market, but at the same time, severely limited the ability of foreign firms to operate and compete in the Chinese market independently. And as well, the Chinese government has limited foreign entry into a certain segment of the Chinese market, including in sectors such as telecommunications and others with applications or implications for the development of artificial intelligence. For example, the Chinese government has created a so-called guidance catalog for foreign direct investment, in which it identifies sectors where foreign direct investment is either encouraged or prohibited. It also maintains a so-called negative list system, whereby certain sectors are either closed off or restricted to foreign investors. So in this area, we have seen how the Chinese government has tried to control certain strategic sectors of the Chinese economy and restrict foreign access, even though it is at the same time selectively liberalizing others to foreign entry. So overall, try to open up the Chinese market to foreign direct investment on China's own terms in a way that helps to preserve China's core economic interests. More recently, we have also seen the Chinese government adopting a set of currency and financial tools to promote expansion of Chinese firms. China has kept the value of the Chinese RMB relatively low and uses state-controlled banks to influence global financial flows. So overall, it has kept the yuan relatively stable to support exporters. In light of the foreign retaliations against China, the Chinese government has resorted to certain trade policy tools as leverage to either punish or reward economic partners. So for instance, in the aftermath of the trade war that took place during the first Trump administration, the Chinese government imposed the tariffs on US agricultural products and some other imports, presumably to target politically sensitive sectors within the United States. China has limited exports of rare earth elements in order to maintain leverage over supply chains in advanced electronics and defense. And at the same time, the government has imposed some controls on outbound investment from China, both in order to keep capital within the country and to prevent strategic technological loss. And more recently, it has also adopted policies that restricted imports from countries that were critical of China. For instance, in response to the deployment of the THAAD missile system by South Korea, the Chinese government has imposed sanctions on certain South Korean brands. So overall, the Chinese leadership has adopted to a set of policies to shift China's role from a factory of the world to both a technological and economic powerhouse with global influence and fewer dependencies.
How does the US deal with economic incompatibilities with China?
These incompatibilities are at the heart of the rising US-China economic conflict, the US-China trade war in the global economic system today. During the late 1980s, for example, Japan was the country that was the target of US trade policy. The US ran a large trade deficit with Japan. There were complaints about the relatively closed nature of the Japanese market and the difficulty of US businesses to access the Japanese market. And yet today, China has replaced Japan as the number one challenge for US trade and economic policy in the Asian Pacific region. And what distinguishes China from Japan is not only the huge size of its domestic economy, but also the fact that China is an authoritarian country that doesn't operate according to Western principles of market competition. And moreover, unlike Japan, is not an ally of the United States. So this has raised a range of questions as to whether the Western economies can coexist with the Chinese economy and the prospect of peaceful competition with China. So I would say that the fact that the Chinese government continues to provide subsidies to SOEs within China, the continuation of industrial policy and other issues, those issues are not going to go away. Those are the hardest part of the Chinese market to crack open. The US may be able to reach certain deals with China on issues that concerns the US business community, and may even be able to reach temporary purchasing deals with China, like what we saw during the first Trump administration. But issues regarding core elements of China's domestic economy are going to be inherently difficult to tackle. And the fact that the United States, under the Trump administration, is increasingly adopting a unilateral approach to deal with China outside of the WTO, in large part reflects the growing US frustration of the ineffectiveness of dealing with China inside the WTO, because WTO jurisprudence really has no precedence of dealing with issues such as subsidies by an industrial policy by a large transitional economy. So those issues pose significant challenges to the operation of the liberal international economic system. And we're likely going to see these incompatibilities play out not only in the area of trade, but also in global finance and foreign aid. China's aid model fundamentally departs from those championed by Western countries. Chinese approach to aid oftentimes have less strings attached compared to Western countries. The Chinese tend to place less emphasis on issues such as human rights or other areas of domestic performance as a condition of the recipient country receiving aid from China. And so these practices put China at fundamental loggerheads with those of Western countries and are likely to continue to be sources of tensions in the global economic system in the years ahead.